Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show.
WandaVision is filmed in front of a live studio audience. No, I'm just kidding. WandaVision is the show that's on Disney Plus, that's from the MCU, and all about Wanda and Vision. Episode 3 starts out in fabulous Brady Bunch of Vision, where Vision, how many times can I say this in one sentence, and Wanda have now gone full 70s Vision with hippy dippy hair and massive sideburns. And the doctors come by to check on Wanda's baby bump, and assures them that everything's fine and normal and they're going to be happy mum and dad in a wee while, but he's off away on his holidays and not to worry about it because he'll be back long before the pregnancy happens. But he also agrees to keep things on the quiet, as far as the pregnancy is concerned, because I think Wanda and Vision want to try and figure out what's going on first before they let everybody else know the happy news. And Herb's out trimming the hedge, although he seems to be not entirely with it. And then Vision pops back inside and Wanda's even further along, and despite the surprise, the pair of them are keen to get along into the baby mood and start converting and decorating the spare room into a nursery. But right in the middle of things, Wanda ends up getting a kick and accidentally turns the mobile into a load of real butterflies. And then at lunchtime she gets a twinge of false contractions and sends the entire house into a total crazy mode, which causes further issues in everybody else's house across town. And for a minute, Vision and Wanda actually start to realise that things aren't entirely right in their life. But weirdly, things blip back to normal and actually no, everything's fine. Strange that. And despite the panic, they manage to calm themselves down just in time for Wanda's water to break. But after she dries things down, Vision rushes off to get the dog and manages to arrive at his house just in time to stop him heading off to Bermuda. Wanda, on the other hand, hears a strange sound from the nursery, and then a ring at the doorbell. And it turns out it's Geraldine who's there to borrow a bucket to bail her own house out. And Wanda has to scramble around to hide her baby belly, and then Geraldine, it turns out, wants to chat about work, and then randomly a stork wanders out of the nursery, and many distraction shenanigans later, Geraldine ends up seeing the nursery, and just then, the baby starts to come, and Geraldine has to help deliver wee baby Tommy. And just as Vision's meeting his son, Wanda pops out baby number 2, Billy. And everything is all good. Except when Vision sees the doctor at the door, he makes a strange comment about nobody ever being able to escape a small town, which makes Vision pause, especially as just then Herb and Agnes are acting a little bit strange over by the wall, and they ask about Geraldine and mention that she's a strange one with no family and no home in the town. But just when they're about to try and talk about it, they get oddly tongue-tied and then suddenly just go back to normal and make a quick exit. Meanwhile, inside, Wanda's looking at her new kids and she ends up thinking about her late brother Pietro and starts singing a Segovian lullaby, just when Geraldine suddenly blurts out,
"He was killed by Ultron, wasn't he?"
And Wanda's more than a little bit confused and angry, and things take a bit of a sinister turn. But when Vision comes back inside, Wanda's strangely placid again, and the show stretches out into movie-style Vision, just as Geraldine flies out of a crack in reality or some kind of magic wall beside a military base and gets instantly surrounded by soldiers. The plot thickens. So what did I think? Well, honestly, this week was kind of a big improvement on episode 2, which I did enjoy at the time, but in the run-up to watching this third one, I actually rewatched the first 2 episodes back to back, and really realised that episode 2 dragged an awful lot on rewatching. I mean, it's still cute and fun, but on the other hand, this episode was just so much better and so much funnier. Although again, hard to say if this one might actually feel a little old in retrospect. But to start with, the colour and vibrancy as well as the crazy long intro for this was an awful lot of fun. I mean, they've really hit the style of those 70s shows. And I'm a fan of those kind of 70s shows. In fact, I'm a fan of literally that 70s show, which did 6 or 7 seasons of a show essentially parodying this exact style of television. And I love that also they did that kind of Mickey take of the opening of the Brady Bunch. And I noticed that all the shapes are hexagons, just like episode 1 and 2 both ended with the shape of a hexagon. And what is the hexagon in nature? What does it come from? What animal? A bee. And we've already had a beekeeper in episode 2, and the colour yellow is oddly conspicuous all over the place, which is also the same colour as Vision's Mind Stone. And that also just happens to be the particular infinity gem that controls people's minds. And on top of all that, the hijinks felt really wonderfully of its time. I mean, this is the episode where the facade really started to drop. I mean, between Herb and his sawing through a brick wall with a hedge cutter, or the Doctor's strange remark, or that jump cut moment with Vision, and especially the final Geraldine stuff where they're getting thrown out of reality. I mean, I feel like the show's starting to play its hand a little bit. And while episode 1 really only had that one single choking moment where everything turned from comedy into sort of horror, and 2 kind of doubled down on that, This week it's straight up drawing attention to the oddness, because it wants you to really pay attention to it. And what's more, we've finally now seen outside the world of Westfield, where clearly it's modern day, or modern day as far as the Marvel universe is concerned. And there seems to be some kind of army base set up with floodlights on a force field or something like that, made out of that same tricolour red, green and blue that the show's end credits animation is. And that's, if you're too young to remember, that's literally what old TVs look like if you put your eyes right up close to the screen. None of this pixels and OLED malarkey you get nowadays. And what surprised me was that, as well as that really obvious stuff like the time skip and Wanda's Sokovian moment, there were other strange things, like notice how the nursery actually had 2 cribs in it right from the very beginning, meaning that there was always going to be 2 kids and they were always preparing for 2 kids even if they didn't realise it. Which also brings me to another point, something I never picked up on until I rewatched all these episodes. And that's how there's been all these mentions of children repeatedly through the show, especially back in episode 1, long before Wanda even got her baby bump.
It's for the children.
For the children.
For the children.
But here we are with these kids being born and Geraldine taking a really big interest. But if there was one thing that was slightly less polished this week, it's that maybe it was a little bit more stilted than previous episodes where, the plot, that being the pregnancy and the show's style, didn't gel quite as well as it did with previous ones. I mean, especially the whole stork moment, which I didn't even realise where the stork was supposed to have come from. I mean, I didn't realise it was meant to be the painting come to life right until that very end shot where it sort of goes back into it again. Similarly, the glitch moment when we see Vision, the moment where he had a problem with reality, sort of gets rewound. Now, that was almost done too subtly. I mean, I wonder if there were people who actually literally looked at their phone or something like that during watching the episode and maybe didn't even notice it happening. And as opposed to like the long rewind, which went on for surprisingly many seconds on the previous episode. And there is also a minor grump, but one that I think is very valid. And although the show is good, maybe folk don't realise it, but the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was a major inspiration for episode 1, and the Brady Bunch, which was a major influence on this episode, they're not staple UK TV shows. I mean, I literally don't ever remember either of these being broadcast in my life, and other than seeing clips on the internet and on other shows and films and things and mentions of it, I've never actually seen them. I've only culturally heard of them. I'm curious to know what they're going to bring up next week. I mean, what other shows they're going to be referencing, because presumably we're now into either late 70s or early 80s shows. And while I don't think we're going to end up getting like an episode of MASH out of this, I feel like we're probably going to end up with some sort of 80s show like Different Strokes or Full House. Another couple of shows that, to be honest, I don't actually think I've ever seen an episode of. And yeah, and then later on we might actually get stuff I have seen, because, by the time they get to the 90s, they're probably going to go down the route of something like Alf or Harry and the Hendersons, shows that I actually did watch because they were on British TV. And I'm not really sure, and I don't really want to scour the trailers and internet for leaks and things, because it might be spoiler territory. But because a lot of these shows are specifically American, I do wonder if Americans realise that they haven't actually been as universally broadcast at the time. But yeah, unlike the greatest show of all time, as I mentioned earlier. But let's just pause for a second, because it's probably about time I offered a few thoughts on what I think's going on in the show now. Now, we've seen that demonstrably there's a bubble of something weird, and obviously Wanda and Vision are inside, and there's what clearly appears to be an agency outside, which is probably S.W.O.R.D, the counterpart S.H.I.E.L.D, and thus probably good guys. And we can guess with some certainty that yes, this is all some kind of an illusion. Or a glamour. Or a bubble. Oh, side point. Hydra used to use soap to control people's minds. It was in an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Would have figured it out a long time ago if it wasn't for the mind control soap.
And there's literally an ad in this for Hydra bubble bath. So, yeah. Wink, wink, nod, nod there. So, anyway, clearly, we've got two factions at work here. We've got faction inside the bubble and a faction outside the bubble, since it's clear from certain moments that while everyone in the town seems to have a slight modicum of self-control or awareness at times, it's also Wanda who's absolutely in charge. I mean, think of moments like Herb choking and his wife literally getting teary-eyed pleading with Wanda to stop it, and then her fixing things. All the while with the wife never breaking that sort of perfect, smiling, composed 1950s sitcom look. Or think about Dottie just before the glass smashing, when she actually got a bit of normality back and she was like, what the hell's going on here?
Who is that? Who are you?
Or the banging sounds in the helicopter, which all presumably mean that Wanda on some level is aware that this isn't real, and I presume the banging noise is these S.W.O.R.D guys outside trying to break into this bubble. While the beekeeper, I mean, he also had a sword symbol on his back, and we never saw his face, and it was deliberately darkened. Although he did kind of look a wee bit like Vision. But anyway, I reckon that he's just another person breaking into the fantasy. Maybe he literally went under the town and then came up through, and actually that's protective gear, not to keep out bees. Maybe he's not a beekeeper, maybe that was just like some kind of hazmat suit. And as I mentioned earlier, there is this beehive motif. So who are the bee people? That's what we don't know. But also, like, the people involved seem desperate to break their programming and at times are struggling against it, but are also terrified of something or someone which might go wrong, which makes me think that they might actually really be the real residents of the town of Westfield who've been caught in this fantasy or experiment or whatever the hell's going on. So, I mean, is Wanda doing this? I mean, I reckon so, but if so, why? And is she really in control? Or is somebody else using her own powers against her by creating this fantasy of a happy life with Vision? And also, because unless something major has happened, I mean, Vision's still dead. He's very dead with a giant hole in his head where, the Infinity Stone used to live and Thanos ripped it out. So, I mean, that could also be the big emotional payoff of the show, with Wanda coming to terms with him being dead. I mean, personally, I reckon that there's actually a new bad guy involved here, like, and the bees are somehow representative. Because S.W.O.R.D is involved, it might mean that it's aliens. I mean, I'm not saying that it's definitely aliens, but it's probably aliens. But really, I mean, again, this was possibly, as I said, a bit of a slow one on rewatch. I mean, some gags maybe work better than others, but maybe that's just because the old-fashioned humour isn't landing as well for me. And who knows, as I said, maybe once we get into the 80s or 90s, I mean, hell, if we get far enough, eventually, surely there's going to be a point where they just hit animated TV show, because, let's face it, the 2000s and early 2010s, I mean, that's really just the age of The Simpsons, Futurama, South Park, and things like American Dad. But anyway, I suspect that's not going to get to that point in the show. The show will be far more marvelly by that stage. But yeah, so that's my thoughts on this. So till next time, you've been watching my grumpy opinions on WandaVision. And a special thanks to everybody listening, and especially my patrons, and most especially to Michelle Forbes and Judith Coloma, my top tier patrons. Thank you, everybody. Everybody stay safe. Cheerio.